part of the reason why we're here is because of what Mike's going to talk about in terms of Project 2025. So I appreciate you all coming, and we'll have questions at the end. Let's give a round of applause for Mike.
It is good to be with you, and I hope that I can help us to think together about possible responses to the Christian nationalist movement that really isn't new. Its roots, you'll find tonight, go back to the 1960s. I'll actually argue it goes back to the First and Second Great Awakening and then moves its way through. And we're going to look at that this evening. But it has deep political implications and social implications for us. I would suggest that perhaps my presentation isn't partisan, it is political, because we're looking at political structures and how we understand them and what the role of democracy is in protecting minority voices, in protecting freedom of expression and religion, because part of the Christian nationalist threat isn't so much that, it is that a person can be free not to have a religion at all, but people who have a religious persuasion or belief are also under threat if it doesn't fit within the framework that Christian nationalism suggests is the only framework to operate from. So that's what I'm going to do tonight in the time that we have together. So our objectives essentially, we're going to explore the features of Christian nationalism generally, but also I want you to begin to understand the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 policy and political agenda, which is central and has been since 1980 in the move. It's been a very patient, long-term project. You're going to find in the end, my suggestion is the response has to be equally patient and methodical and long-term. So we can't afford to give up or roll over or acquiesce. Sometimes preemptively, I have found, we can't afford to do that. So I'll be talking about that. I also want you to consider the impact of a term we use in social science called state capture, because it really is a very methodical strategy to gain control of the levers of political power. And that has been what has been executed by the Heritage Foundation since 1980 and producing quite a bit of fruit from their perspective. I want to also document the Trump administration's implementation of Project 2025. Some of you may remember in the 2024 election cycle, the then former president had no idea, about Project 2025. You're going to find out that 31 people, including Russ Vought, Office of Management and Budget Director, are in the administration quietly and sometimes not so quietly implementing Project 2025. So I'm going to hit the high points of that this evening. And we're also going to examine democratic resilience building actions as responses to this. I am not an expert in Project 2025. I have taught it. I taught at the School of Social Work before I've now moved to West Virginia Wesleyan. But I am interested in developing a psychology around radicalization and how we understand the radicalizing process, because that's actually what's happened. I was talking to an expert just this week that actually works for the federal government, and they study radicalization, and she has a very keen sense and interest in what's going on in the Project 2025 movement. So it's a thing, and we'll be talking about it this evening. In a book, 2006, so you're going to find that there were writers back in the middle 2000s who were kind of sounding the alarm, putting books out, writing articles to try to alert us. But there was a book by Chris Hedges called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. He isolated some very disturbing trends that are features of Christian nationalism as he was isolating them then. Now, they've demonstrated themselves to come true. I mean, he was quite accurate in his assessment. And let me use this qualifier. There are those, perhaps those who will view this at some point later on, that will take umbrage at the association of fascism with Christian nationalism. I want to suggest to you that to identify fascism in its modern forms in no way denigrates the horror of the mid-20th century. I think we've got to get over that. I've heard a lot of that. You can't use the word fascist because it somehow diminishes. No, it is a warning. It is a siren that says, let nonetheless never go back there again, because that's where fascism takes us. So I am not of the opinion, you don't have to agree with me, but I am not of the opinion that talking about fascism as a social scientist, as one who looks at these kinds of things, that is in fact in no way denigrating what took place in the mid-20th century. So I think we've got to get past that. Not the horrors of it, we need to remember those so that we never repeat them again. And so in his book, he really did draw on some features that I think you'll find disturbing. There is a distorted Christian nationalist view of Christian faith that's part of this. It kind of marries the cultural and the economic features of American conservatism. Now, I like the word conservatism over conservatism because I think I really want to carve it out as a kind of, I don't know, an ideology, but also a framework. So I know that's not supposed to be a word. I think it's a better use of the word than conservatism, which sounds actually milder than what I'm talking about. So you'll hear me talk about conservatism. Sometimes I'll use the word conservatism because I actually think it's more accurate, but that's neither here nor there. He also suggests that there is a culture of despair, or we know it as grievance. Have you noticed how the politics from the right is one entirely of grievance? Everything is horrible. Everything is bad. Even when I'm in charge, everything's still apparently bad. And there's no one that says, wait a minute, time out. Who's in charge here? But that goes along with it. There's just, I'm mad and angry at everything and everybody. That goes along with Christian nationalism. The cult of masculinity, including visceral opposition to anti-DEI through the anti-DEI movement, LGBTQ plus rights, other cultural shifts. These folks see these as personal threats. And so this is the origin of the culture war, and it really is a hyper-masculinity that's at root. And you'll see it in the Defense Department. I'm actually going to use the congressional term for that department. The Defense Department, in the language and rhetoric that's coming from there, you're hearing this kind of cult of masculinity as you see actually people of color and women are actually pushed aside from leadership currently. There's also a sense of being persecuted. Only in America, where evangelical Christianity is big business, could we convince somebody that evangelical Christianity is under major persecution in our time. It just doesn't make any sense, but that's part of the shtick. It's part of the MO. It's part of the framework that's put out there. Also, he determined that there's a war on truth and the rise of misinformation. Now, in 2006, he couldn't have seen anything yet compared to what we see today. But this kind of, some have called it, and this actually goes back to the Stalinist years, the fire hose of misinformation is really a way of kind of wearing down and blowing away the opposition. You just kind of throw so much falsehood out there that people just get tired and they give up and they roll over. Also a new class, the emergent class, which is largely dominated by white males or male-allied individuals, Christian evangelical, capitalist, upwardly mobile, and traditionalist. These features come together. These are true Americans in this view. These are the patriots. These are the ones that are leaders that love their country, the only ones that have merit and should be recognized for merit. You're hearing all of that rhetoric. Now, this was 20 years ago that this book was published, but we're seeing it kind of being played out. That's why I wanted to start with it tonight. Also, the crusade as a motif. I have heard it from the sitting defense secretary, the language of crusade that's been being used today. The commercialized or commercialization of God. I'd already told you Christianity is big business in the United States, and there is this kind of, could we call it a Christian industrial complex that's kind of emerged. And so we see that happening. And then, of course, there is this apocalyptic violence or the anticipation of it, and maybe even the longing for it that takes place in this particular movement. Again, Hedges' work went back to 2006, but it seems pretty prescient to me as I look at what he was suggesting. So 20 years later, here we are. Now, there's another book I want to reference for you, Paxton's The Anatomy of Fascism, written around the same time, 2004. Again, small print, sorry for that, but I will get these out to you if you'd like them. He talks about several features of fascism. Again, this is not, you cannot say, oh, someone's just got a bone to pick with the current administration and they're just being hypercritical and nitpicking things. He wrote this 22 years before now. And so this really comes out of the scholarship of the 20th century and the social science and political phenomenon of fascism. And so what Paxton found was something he calls palingenesis, this revolutionary myth of either national birth or rebirth. What is the movement called?
Nationalism.
Well, yeah, what's the movement that underpins it right now? Make America Great Again. It buys right into that language, that kind of mythological motif. Mussolini did the same thing. Hitler did the same thing. The Japanese didn't do it so much because that culture was always a deep part of the foundation of their identity. But it was a movement in Europe, and we're kind of following that playbook, it seems to me. Extreme authoritarianism. So you have dictatorial centralized autocracy with a rejection of liberal democracy, pluralism, and individual rights, which the professor is going to talk about next time. So you're going to get some of that as well. Militarism, the belief that violence and war are necessary and glorious tools for achieving national growth and empire. Listen to the language. Look at some of the recent military actions and what their either stated purpose or the absence of any stated purpose may have been, and it causes one to wonder. Totalitarian ambitions, the goal to absorb all social, professional, and independent organizations into the machinery of state. Okay, think about that. I don't think you have to be real creative to see how there are parallels in our current culture. The cult of personality, the elevation of a charismatic leader who embodies the spirit and the will of the nation. I guess. So there it is. And then, of course, anti-communism, violent hostility toward Marxism, socialism, labor unions, while simultaneously restructuring the economy around state control, and I would add oligarchy. And so you see that movement. Now, this was 22 years ago. So again, Paxton didn't have some sort of bone to pick in being some kind of partisan. He's a scholar. And this is what he found. So I think that's pretty telling. In the book, and we're going to get finished with, I'm not just going to review books the whole time, but I think it is helpful to let you know there is a body of scholarship out there. And many of these are written for public consumption. So they're really very accessible and readable. And I do have a bibliography at the end, when you get the PowerPoints, then you can look that up. But Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, much more recent by Whitehead and Perry. Now, according to Whitehead and Perry, there are four kinds of people that are in the United States relative to the U.S. being a Christian nation. Now, I'm certain everybody doesn't fall into four camps, but Whitehead and Perry find that there are basically four approaches to that thesis. Now, some of you may not have been around evangelical circles. I actually was through my teen years and in my early 20s when they were putting out, I even forget some of the organizations, but they were tied to Pat Robertson and some other groups, putting out curriculum that would go to first Christian schools and then homeschoolers. It was talking about how the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and essentially theocracy was really the intention of the framers of the Constitution. It is the second president, John Adams, who made the statement that America would do well with more lighthouses than churches. So I'm not exactly sure that that's what the framers of the Constitution thought. However, he finds that 21.5% of the population, this is in 2020, would be rejectors. The U.S. is a secular nation founded on Enlightenment-era social contract constitution with a distrust of undue religious influence. Ding, 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 that's history. You may not like it, it may not be your preference, that's actually history. And that's pretty hard to argue with if you've ever read it. Resistors, 26.6%, acknowledge Christianity has been historically pervasive and influential, but has a discomfort in identifying the U.S. as a Christian nation. Okay, so already we're looking at 48%, almost half, kind of looks like how the votes sometimes break out, almost half the population that you can see as allies in this work of resisting Christian nationalism. So that's not anything to sneeze at, 48%. So you don't have too many that you have to persuade over to your position. 32.1%, the accommodators, and these are the folks that you'd have to peel some people out of. The accommodators are responsive to Christian nationalist message, but they're not militant about it. Now here's my hunch. This is just my, one could say either educated or uneducated hunch, but it is my hunch nonetheless, that some have been peeled out of this group and radicalized since the study was done in 2020. So I think some would be a little more virulent about their Christian nationalism than maybe in 2020, because I think we've seen that actually grow, not abate. But there are also those who are starting to sour on MAGA right now, whether it's Iran or it's Epstein files or it's something else. Slowly, there are some that are kind of peeling away to where the current president's numbers are around the mid-30s in most polls right now. So my hunch is that there's some volatility and a lot of movement around this. And then, of course, there are ambassadors. They're all in, 19.8%, all in on Christian nationalism, all in on theocracy, suggesting it is the true identity for the United States. That's the framework we're looking at, because organizations like yours is about public education and bringing issues to people and organizing people. And so knowing what you're dealing with and knowing where your allies can be found, that's pretty important, it seems to me. Now, let me read some words of prominent founders. Speaking of, I didn't capture the one by John Adams. I have others. James Madison said, "Religious bondage shackles and debilitates the mind and unfits it for every noble enterprise." This is his letter to William Bradford. Now, I'm a clergy person. I'm not here to attack religion. I just want to clear the record, which is that we do not have a bunch of 21st century evangelicals that founded the country, and that's what they intended. That's not true. That's not historical. George Washington, "The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, and requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." And this was speaking to a Hebrew congregation, a Jewish congregation. He was essentially saying there is no religious test to be a good American in the United States. Benjamin Franklin, "When a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself. And when it does not support itself and God does not take care to support it," that's a little bit of Franklin humor, "it's so that its professors are obliged to call for help from civil power. 'Tis a sign, I apprehend, of it being a bad one." So that is Benjamin Franklin. And then John Adams, not the quote that I quoted. This is a little more, he was being a little more academic here. "The United States of America have exhibited perhaps the first example of governments erected on the simple principles of nature. And if men are now sufficiently enlightened to disabuse themselves of artifice, imposture, hypocrisy, and superstition, they will consider this event as an era in their history." He was no fan. Probably John Adams was the least religious of our American presidents in history, but also a very important framer of the early American experiment. So let's look at a brief history of Christian nationalism, because I also want to be mindful that there needs to be a time of questions and comments and all of that. The first and second Great Awakenings in the 19th century, the early and the later 19th century, I would cite. Now, I don't find a lot of others talking about that, but I've studied this period a lot. And the United States was essentially fairly neutral about religion, if non-religious. You probably had people in the teens that were going at the percentage that were going to church in the early 1800s, I should say, the 19th century. You had double-digit percentage of people going to church. And then the first Great Awakening happened. That was more in the mainline Protestant denominations, Presbyterians, United Methodists, some American Baptists, or what became American Baptists, they weren't then, but that movement. And then you have the second Great Awakening later on that really, it gave rise to kind of the evangelicalism, the roots of evangelicalism that we see today. And those movements really did kind of, should I say, baptize America in religiosity. And that's really where it's found. It wasn't at its founding, contrary to what people tell you. That's just not historical. But it was following the first and second, particularly the second Great Awakening, that you see this kind of, which would give us, not too many years later, the Scopes monkey trial and ridiculous kind of exercises like that. Go read on it. We don't have time to talk about that tonight. I would also then say the next phase to look at is what I call the "In God We Trust" nationalism of post-World War II in the Cold War era. Most people think that "In God We Trust" has always been on our money? Nope, since the 1950s. Most people think standing to pledge the flag is something we've always done. I think the early framers would have thought that somewhat odd, actually, to stand and pledge a flag. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't. I'm not a big fan, but I just don't see the point. It just strikes me as I don't want to check my brain and say whatever my government does is okay with me. I can't say that because it has not always been okay with me. And I don't think it's always been okay with you. And I don't think it's always been okay for people of color, for women, for LGBTQ individuals, you name it. I think we can find a good list of people for whom it has not always been okay or done the right thing. So I think that was another phase of kind of our lurch toward Christian nationalism. Then a man by the name of R.J. Rushdoony. He is the satanic figure in my vision of telling this history because he publishes a book called The Institutes of Biblical Law. And they could be, I consider them a form of Christian Sharia, a blueprint for theocracy. Rushdoony would advocate things like disobedient children should be stoned to death just like it's called for in the Levitican law. He would say that homosexuals should be executed because that is the law. And so it really set the framework and the seedbed for kind of the most extreme elements of Christian nationalism today, which from my perspective is nothing short of an Atwoodian Handmaid's Tale vision for the world. That's really what I think is up here. 1979, and an associate of Rushdoony, you may have heard of him, Jerry Falwell, he will form the Moral Majority, which is an organization that directly got involved in politics, and would pick abortion as the issue to galvanize the religio-conservative political movement, which had actually been not really that major an issue even for evangelicals up until 1979, but it was for Roman Catholics, but it was not for Protestants until after the Moral Majority. And that was the lightning rod issue that was chosen to kind of galvanize. And we saw in the 80s, 90s, and 2000 one-issue voters who were voting simply on the issue of abortion. And to that degree, Falwell was infinitely successful in doing what he set out to do. 1980s and 90s, you have the emergence of the televangelists, the rise of right-wing media, including Rush Limbaugh, Pat Robertson. The Heritage Foundation's own political policy prescriptions start to be developed and start to be implemented. 2016, QAnon, conspiracy theorizing, left-right fringe convergence in MAGA, which has been kind of unusual in our history, but we've seen that, which brings us then, which I think is kind of the culmination of this movement politically and from a Christian nationalist perspective, January 6th. And of course, there was then the push to create, and it was published 2024, Project 2025, because they determined what they didn't get done in 2016, they were going to get it right next time from their perspective. And that's precisely where we find ourselves. Now, you can't see this very well either. Again, I apologize. But I will say that there have been 16 iterations of the mandate for leadership, which is what we now call Project 2025. I'm not going to go through all 16 of them because I've already seen your eyes glaze over at the thought there were 16 of them. One of them, I forget which one, was 3,000 pages long. The last iteration was over 900 pages. Now, I had some social work students that I made read it one semester. They may have never forgiven me for that. But at any rate, the first one was 1981, the Mandate for Leadership, first edition. And essentially it focused on what was the Reagan Revolution. Deregulate business, downsize government, lower taxes. So you're kind of boilerplate conservative, although that was a kind of new conservatism, really. But your boilerplate, what you think of with the standard conservative today. 1989 was the next big initiative that was called the Mandate for Leadership 3. That was the George H.W. Bush administration, and it simply advocated to continue the trajectory of the Reagan Revolution. So that's what it advocated. It was in 2001, with the ascendancy of George W. Bush, that they started to emphasize this has been working pretty well, so let's add some stuff. So the stuff they added is even now, 20 years later, 20 some odd years later, 25, being implemented. School choice, privatization of social services, sweeping deregulation. You think of DOGE, you think of Hope Scholarship, you think of a lot of right-wing attempts to really kind of dismantle what had been important features. I can tell you and I don't mean this to be accusatory of my own family, because I know this is being contributed or being recorded. I was raised in a probably very racist family. That's how they saw the world. They would make statements they had certain phrases for certain people that we just don't use. What insulated me from that? What helped me to step away from that was being educated in public schools in the 1970s. That was probably the golden era. That was the Sesame Street generation, and that was the era where we began to celebrate diversity and understand tolerance, and it really did shape me. Can you see why we would want those who would want this to be rolled back would attack first public education and make sure it's privatized, that homeschooling is the norm or private schools are the norm, that our schools are poorly funded? It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That goes back to 2001, 25 years ago. Then we have 2016. You might remember such great hits as the first Trump administration. Mandate for leadership, blueprints for new beginnings, tax cuts, and then they added all the school choice stuff, but adding environmental regulation, or particularly deregulation, which was a major hallmark of that document. And then Project 2025, which we're going to spend some time on, in addition to these other things. So it's not like, well, let's abandon these things and do something else. It's in addition. It's like you give somebody an inch, they want a mile. So this is the next mile. Consolidating executive power. If it's the right party, apparently, because that doesn't... dismantling the Department of Education, overhauling federal agencies to align with conservative priorities, culture war issues, combat diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and push against administrative agencies, and really the insulated bureaucracy that really does insulate itself, or should, because of the Hatch Act, insulate itself from undue political pressure. So in the document itself, again, because it's like that. Remember Dow scrubbing bubbles in the 80s? I had to work hard so you don't have to. So as I read through Project 2025, these are the four basic fronts, and they call them fronts. Now that sounds like battle language to me. These are the four basic fronts that they talk about in the introduction to their document. One, to restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. Okay, I wonder what the family looks like in a Project 2025 vision, you see. It is a dominant male, a wife who perhaps stays at home, and then, 2.5 children, or whatever it is, 2 cars, a dog, a golden retriever usually, that kind of thing.
White children.
And white children, yes, that's right, because we do not prioritize children of color, at least. You can say, how can you say that? Why just follow the money? If you don't spend money on places where children of color live, you must not prioritize children. I mean, it just seems logical to me. The second front, to dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. To the right American people, you see, the ones who see the world in resonance with the Project 2025. Because if not, then you disenfranchise people. You make sure they can't vote or can't vote easily, or make it so difficult to vote they just give up. So it's not the people, it's the right people. You have to read, and that's not me reading too much into the language. Once you read it, you'll see that it is a steady diatribe of misogyny and racism. That's really what the Project 2025 document does. Also, to defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats, like immigrants who actually prop up the economy, or something like that, these perceived threats. But again, if you can other people in society, it's really a divide and conquer grievance-oriented strategy. That's really what I found it to be. And then secure our God-given, this is their language, God-given individual rights to live freely. But here's the thing, that doesn't mean to love whomever you want to love. That doesn't mean to believe whatever you want to believe or not believe. That actually means laissez-faire capitalism. The only way to live freely is to have an unmitigated, unregulated capitalist economic structure. That's actually the only thing that the whole document's concerned with when you talk about freedom. So just when you see the word freedom, you must read it through economic lenses, because that's what they intend in the document. Let's look at the expanding presidential power thing, which is a big issue in Project 2025. It calls for a civil service overhaul, which was implemented almost immediately after inauguration, places the federal bureaucracy directly under presidential control by stripping job protections from thousands of civil servants, which had been undone actually, because, back in the early 20th century, the Harding, Coolidge, Hoover years, the government realized, wait a minute, you can't have the bureaucracy switch every time there's a new president, and it can't function that way. So we've had protections in place since the early part of the 20th century, but all of those are to be eroded and have been eroded under the Project 2025 vision. Independent agencies subject independent regulatory bodies to the Department of Justice and the Federal Communications Commission like that, or education, or you can pick, under White House command and control. That really is what Project 2025 calls for, because then there's no accountability. Did you notice that any inspector general over any agency was immediately canned and fired at the very outset? Because you couldn't do some of these things with watchdogs in place. These were pressure points and stopgaps that were placed there by Congress to make sure corruption could be reined in. And then, of course, loyalty vetting builds a database of pre-screened, this is what they call for, ideologically aligned personnel to quickly fill thousands of federal positions, which they quickly implemented in the new administration. Justice and law enforcement, weaponizing the DOJ, even while you're saying that others had weaponized the DOJ. So we call that a straw man and logical fallacy when we're talking about argumentation and reasoning to make an issue that isn't an issue. And so there really wasn't this weaponization, but there really clearly seems to be today. And especially around the enforcement of civil rights laws in the courts, eliminating administrative tools like consent decrees, due process procedures like habeas corpus. There are other things that are very much under threat in the current cultural climate. And prosecute supposed reverse racism. So I can tell you I've had a burden to bear in life being a white male. It's just been the hardest thing that I ever could imagine. Again, it's that strange grievance that kind of turns the world upside down from what it actually is to a world you imagine it to be. That really is the whole structure. And then targeting the FBI, again, because in recent decades, since the Hoover years, in its period of corruption, it really has been kind of a watchdog agency over corruption, even in government. But what you do is restructure, significantly limit the jurisdiction of the FBI, and then, of course, think about how you might be able to make sure that it has no teeth. And we find that, for example, you saw that in places recently like Minnesota and others where it had just been so gutted that there really was no federal response quickly to kind of deal with some of the crises that we've gone through. What about reproductive health and social issues? I'm trying to give you the high point. None of my sons that are here tonight, but my second son, he's always kind of been high on adrenaline. And when he used to mow the lawn when he was little, he'd put it in the highest gear, and I think he only mowed the high spots in the yard. He went so fast. That's all I'm going to be able to do tonight is mow the high spots, because it is a 900-plus document. But I do want to hit the stuff that you're seeing out there. So it calls for abortion restrictions, advocates for reviving 19th century Comstock Act, which you hear a lot about, to criminalize the mailing of abortion medications and equipment, effectively restricting access. Because wherever you are on the issue or the topic, most of us are not for women nearly dying or dying in the parking lot of an emergency room because the doctors are too afraid to act to save the life of young women or women of any age. You just don't want that to happen. Banning contraception. Seeks to restrict access to certain emergency contraceptives particularly, and eliminate requirements that health plans cover birth control. So it's not a ban on contraceptives, it's just making them very difficult to get or unaffordable. And then, of course, eliminating LGBTQ plus protections, things like mandating the removal of gender identity and sexual orientation from federal regulations, and you'll find in forms now, and the end of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. I was a student, am still a student, I'm working on my dissertation, now I'm finished my coursework. I'm a candidate, but I was a student, Ph.D. student at WVU, right when things happened at the beginning of 2025, and I can tell you that the university did preemptively quake in fear of funding streams being cut off and other things, and they unfortunately often acted preemptively to avoid any kind of conflict with the administration. I'm going to suggest in the end we need to do the opposite of that. We need to wait till we're made to do certain things rather than acquiesce up front, but we'll get there. Government agency restructuring. Well, you saw the DOGE thing. So dismantle departments, call for the complete elimination of Education Department or Department of Homeland Security because they really want to retool it. Project 2025, and that's what the government's doing right now, wants to retool it to be mostly an immigration-focused kind of thing rather than actually securing the homeland. And I'm not even a fan of the word homeland because it still smacks to 20th century Germany to me. I never liked it since they started using it back in 2001, but here we all are. These many years later. Public health reforms splits the Center of Disease Control and Prevention into two separate entities. That makes a whole lot of sense. And restricts its authority to issue mandates. Unless, of course, they're going to be ridiculous mandates, which they can't seem to stop spouting off. That's my opinion. You don't have to agree. And then climate and weather data. This is a bizarre thing. And I think it goes back to the Sharpie hurricane event in the first administration, but wants to realign and dismantle the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and calls to privatize the National Weather Service. Because that's what we want is for-profit weather companies telling us, yes, the Sharpie really was right. That's where that's where we're at these days. Family-related policy. Let's take a shift. And I'm going to read now from Project 2025 defines the traditional family as married, heterosexual couple. This is from their document, raising their own children. See, I told you when they talked about emphasizing the family, it wasn't what maybe some of us are thinking about when we think of family. So it is a married heterosexual couple raising their own children and considers this structure the bedrock of a healthy American society. It advocates for the federal policies and tax codes designed to incentivize the nuclear family while discouraging non-traditional family structures and alternative living arrangements. So there's a very clear goal of shaping society and shaping relationships and shaping families. So the core principles and goals would be, of course, heteronormative and traditional roles in a marriage-centric society, traditional gender roles, and reversing demographic decline, because that seems to be the fear. And it's not demographic decline, because there are elements of our culture that are growing. What demographic are they worried is declining? Does anybody have a guess? Yeah, they look a lot like me. Ding, ding, ding. Yeah, that's it. You're right. That's what's being worried. It's not that we're going to lose population. It's we're going to lose the good part of the population, and we're going to grow the wrong parts. That's not my words. I'm actually being as sarcastic, but the reality is that is the orientation of this document. So here's some proposed policy changes to restore the traditional family as the centerpiece of American life. Tax code adjustments to support traditional marriages with children. Marriage boot camps, this is literally in the document, as mandatory to curb divorce rates, okay? So if you're not getting along, you can't do anything to you, you're sent to a boot camp. You know, that works well in domestic violence situations. You think about the lunacy of that in the modern age. Housing priorities for married families with children. Okay, so if you're not married, if you don't have children, or you're not traditional, then you're not prioritized. Removal of gender language from federal rules and laws. Prioritize the nuclear family over all other forms of household and excluding LGBTQ plus families, narrowing the legal definition of family to actively erase same-sex marriages and families, stigmatizing single parents, labeling homes with absent fathers or single mothers as primary sources of poverty, crime, and societal issues. These are indicative of societal issues, but it's usually not the individuals, it's the society that has the issue that we're not caring for people in the proper way. And then, of course, limiting family planning, because you 2.5 children need to become 7.5 children, or whatever, I don't know what the number is for them. Project 2025 in the Trump administration. Russell Vought, you probably have heard his name, Director of Office of Management and Budget, one of the most powerful positions in the government, and one of the key authors of Project 2025, is aptly shepherding the 2025 agenda through the Trump administration. Sometimes very quietly, sometimes not so quietly, but he's shepherding that through. You'll be interested to know to what degree. He was the deputy director in the first Trump administration. He also, in the interim, served as a lobbyist for the policy arm of the Heritage Foundation. Now, a wonderful organization, if you want to look them up, the Center for Progressive Reform, it follows and tracks Project 2025. They estimate that 53% of the goals of that 900 plus page document have been implemented since January 2025 in just 1.5 years. 53%. 30 authors and Russell Vogt, which is at least 31 authors, are working in high levels of the Trump administration today. Okay, so to say that there's no connection, nothing to see here. There's no, the Wizard of Oz is really, well, it's a bunch of people at a think tank behind the curtain, and it's Heritage Foundation, and they're the ones that are pulling all the levers and making things happen. Axios in 2025, so last year, reported on those goals as yet unrealized. These are the things they're working to do. Outlawing pornography. Now you can think about that and maybe have different views, but there's also kind of a free speech, and then what someone sees as pornography, others may see as art. I know it's complicated. It always has been a First Amendment quandary. The dignity of women and people generally, as I get it, but I'm not sure their strategy is going to be the one I'm comfortable with if they're going to. And then having the National Weather Service fully commercialize its forecasting operations. Again, I don't understand that. So we're going to get an emergency alert, but we have to pause for a 30-second commercial, and then they come back and warn us that we need to take cover. Congress amending the Fair Labor Standards Act to require time-and-a-half hours for work on the Sabbath. So you have to ask if you're Seventh-day Baptist or if you're Jewish, or is Sabbath different, or do they really just mean the evangelical Christian Sabbath on Sabbath? I don't know. It doesn't really define that. Standalone cabinet-level border and immigration enforcement agencies, which they really, even though it's yet to be done, they've lurched very far in that direction by sort of co-opting existing bodies. Lifetime cap on benefits through Medicare and Medicaid for health coverage payouts. Can you imagine having Medicare have a lifetime cap on it if you had some sort of catastrophic illness? Now, who does that currently?
Insurance companies.
Insurance companies, yeah. So it makes me think maybe they want to turn the chicken coop over to the foxes. I'm not sure what is up with that, but that's what it kind of sounds like to me. Standalone cabinet-level border and immigration enforcement agency. Again, they're lurching in that way, but they've simply co-opted existing bodies. I already mentioned that. Further bans on reproductive services like the abortion pill, and there was a Supreme Court decision that kind of halted that a little bit most recently, but there's still an attempt to do that. And then further undermine education funding mechanisms and essentially, because you may not know this about, I did a paper not long ago on Hope Scholarship. It does not provide additional money for the Hope Scholarship. It takes existing education money and simply reroutes it out of public education to homeschools, private schools, that kind of thing. So what do? You starve an institution of resources and then you can make it go away is the idea. So it builds on the popular evangelical view, and somebody and we were talking about this before, the Seven Mountain Mandate. Have you ever heard about the Seven Mountains Mandate? You have my sympathies. But according to this theory, it is that there are 7 mountains. It's a metaphor, of course. There are 7 institutional frameworks within society that if you can capture them, this gets to our social science term of state capture. If you can capture them, then you can really take over the culture. Religion, the institutional church and spiritual life. So again, you think, well, are Christians going to fare pretty well? You have to be the right kind of Christian to fare pretty, because I would wager to say most Christian nationalists would not consider me a Christian. I'm a 35-year veteran in the United Methodist Church. That ought at least get me a cup of coffee. But the point is, I've done that for 35 years, but I'm not significant enough, sufficient enough, good enough to be considered a Christian, because I don't kind of, I'm too leftist, or I'm too progressive, or I'm too moderate in my education, or whatever it is. They just don't trust people like me. The family is the foundational unit of society, so kind of take over the family. And how do you do it? Through this kind of hyper masculinity and sort of kind of reroute the institution of the family through that lens. Education. So schools, universities, shaping young minds. It's not just to start their own, which they've done, but to defund the standard apparatus within society and starve it of resources. Government, politics, law, and civil authority. And if you do not think that Mitch McConnell, for all of his pearl clutching now, he was one of the key people in making sure the judiciary took a very right-wing lurch in the first Trump administration. And we're seeing the results of that today, including the Supreme Court. And of course, you remember what happened there. And then, of course, media. So it's interesting. The mainstream media typically are attached to the legacy media institutions, which are still restrained by the FCC. But you may not know that cable news, some of you do, is not restrained by the FCC. So essentially, you're saying, let's go into the debate with one or both hands, maybe every limb tied behind your back, and try to have public discourse or debate that way. And that's been the strategy since 1980. Arts and entertainment, Hollywood music, although that's not working well. I understand that the Obama Center today had quite a concert. Apparently, we couldn't get anybody together to celebrate the 250th. Well, but it was ironic to me. I'm not really making fun. I am making fun, but it's ironic to me that happened today. So maybe arts and entertainment isn't quite there yet. I don't know. And then business, commerce, economics, corporate leadership, to which you said, maybe they've always had that. I don't know. But the point is that those are the areas. You take each of these areas, then you can control all of society. You have all access to how information flows, how it's received, how it's curated, and you can begin to see that today. That's the Seven Mountains Mandate. And that goes back to the 2000s. So let's look at this idea of state capture. I want you to learn that term. It is a social science term. Comes out of political science and social science. David Barrett, her work in 2023, she sees there are three stages to state capture. And one is regulatory capture or kleptocracy, which is both protecting of plutocrats and oligarchs, because kleptocracy is really government by essentially theft, legalized theft by taking resources. We've seen the gap between the rich and the poor, not only in racial lines, which is exacerbated in ways that was astounding to me to hear Ron talk about, but they have widened, probably they're at the widest divide since they were measured. And so that's kind of being implemented. Disabling government bodies, civil service that would hold these parties to account. Get rid of inspectors general, get rid of certain agencies, get rid of other people, make the first branch of government so acquiescent to the second that it simply becomes a rubber stamp. Disabling institutions that would hold these parties to account. And so you discredit courts in the minds of people, or you Southern Poverty Law Center, you start to attack groups like this doing yeoman's work out there to create equity, and you attack them. These become aided and abetted by media silos that propagandize. I will not mention, although I could mention any particular network, but you can tell those who listen to certain networks and not others. You can simply tell. They are oblivious to anything that's going on in the world around them. And so let me give you an example. I need to hurry and I won't take too long. I was just reading today, I saw a curated on my Yahoo feed. Comes from an unnamed news source that ran a report about how this one young woman who was at 14 at the time went through sex reassignment surgery at age 14, and now she's suing the doctor. Her life was ruined. So I thought, I wonder just how often that's happening in the United States, because that is horrendous. I'm a counselor. That's a horrendous thing. I found out that people under age 15, since we've started doing this, it amounts to 1 in 1 million, which means maybe 300 people in our recent history have been in that age group. But that's not how the story was told. The story was told so that my uncles, or your uncles, or whoever at Thanksgiving that we don't talk to about these things any longer, would explode. Their heads would blow up, thinking this is out there. They're going into our middle schools and taking all of our children to Ruby Memorial, and they're reassigning them. That's what people are meant to think, and they don't have the information. So I began to look at what are the actual facts. And it was the NIH is where I got the data. It wasn't like I went to some sort of news outlet that was just amenable to my view of the world. It was the NIH that published this data. So it doesn't hurt. That's why I think science and evidence is mistrusted, because it doesn't paint. It has a strange bias toward reality that some people don't want to. So Project 2025 and Christian nationalism share the same goals. That's why I've tried to merge them and converge them here, which is the undermining of democracy in favor of an autocratic rollback of liberal democratic. And I don't mean liberal. I'm a progressive. Liberal is an older term that had to do with really just basic freedoms within society. pretty capitalist structure, that I'm a progressive, so I don't know if I would call myself a liberal in this, but liberal here doesn't mean political. It just means kind of traditional sort of basic freedoms, protection of minorities, small r Republican government, representative government. And so it's a rollback of these tendencies. Now, why? And their goals and policies. Why? Because they're not conducive. The majoritarian view is not conducive to 2025 goals, Project 2025 goals. And the only way you can implement them is to not allow the populace to have any say about it because it's too unpopular. So you think 35% approval rating, that is probably pretty indicative of where these policies are. So you can't implement them unless somehow you find a way to circumvent democracy. And that's my concern. And I think that's the concern of this organization. It sounds like your name. It sounds like what you're interested in. So I titled this The Democratic, the Process, Not the Party response, because I don't think it's going to help if I'm Hakeem Jeffries' spokesperson today, because I'm not sure some of them aren't asleep at the switch right now. But the Democratic, the process, not the party, response to the Christian nationalism and Project 2025 threat. These are simply my suggestions. So for all the work, I'm not an expert, but I have studied, thought about, taught these things for many years, and these are things that I'm suggesting. I haven't gotten them all. I had to narrow it down to something to say to you tonight, so here it is. Do not preemptively acquiesce to attempts to roll back liberal institutional norms, order, framework within society. Make them make us. Make them make us back down. I think that, so I'm a big believer in civil disobedience. I'm a big believer in standing up for basic human freedoms and basic human rights, and make them back us down. Do not roll over. Secondly, expose the implications of these extreme policies to the public, which is what you're trying to do. That's what this is about. And their impact on our way of life through strategic information and educational efforts. Some people just don't know. If you've got 48% of the people with you, and you can peel off another 3 or 4% that might see 2025 as way too extreme, then you've got electoral majorities, and that's what you need. So think about it, because I'm going to suggest we have to use the same strategic, methodical, long-term view that the Heritage Foundation had. They did not give up. They went right on through the Clinton administration. They went right on through the Obama administration. They went right on through the Biden administration, doing their work within the walls, like termites do. Did I say that out loud? And then, bam, there it is. You see, like emerald. Bam, there it is. And it's in front of us, and it's reality in 1.5 years. Okay, 53% of it. That's what I'm talking about. My third suggestion is that we codify democratic norms and election processes and no longer assume the goodwill of political actors to do the right thing or have a sense of honor. I personally blame President Biden for the situation we're in simply because he assumed it's behind us now. We can go back to the good old boy system, the good old boy structure. We don't have to worry. We don't have to. And I would have wished his world were true. I think he was of noble and good heart and intention. It's just he was naive, I think. That's just my opinion. And the reason he never called to ask me about it is because he didn't care, and I probably don't know enough to advise him. But my point is to say they needed, when he had two branches of Congress, to pass laws to make sure what's happening could never happen again. And that was not the priority. It was better never to mention it again and just assume we could all come back to the Thanksgiving table and be happy together. And that was, I think, a gross miscalculation. We need to codify these open, gaping holes in democracy that have been revealed, and we cannot depend upon people to do the right thing or honor or goodwill, because I find honor to be grossly in short supply right now, it seems to me. Fourthly, to codify constitutional norms, particularly those related to the separation of powers and Article 2 powers of the president, have been conducted, they've been done by decorum. The president acted out of decorum, tradition, and a sense of goodwill and honor. You can't count on that to ever happen again. The DOJ policy that the president cannot be his behavior cannot be criminalized or seen as criminal, rather, that's the appropriate way to say it. Nonsense. That needs to go away because you cannot commit crimes in office and have any kind of moral integrity and expect everybody else to obey and follow the law. That needs plugged. And so we need to separate those powers out very clearly, not just assume people will follow some sort of decorum. Fifthly, to rest, there are 10, because 10 is what everybody does, top 10. What was the guy? See, that's how, I'm not old enough to remember David Letterman, that's it. David Letterman. So David Letterman, top top 10 stuff. Wrest the political process and the media structures from the plutocrats, and democratize it by limiting moneyed influence, banning political funding by corporations, restrict lobbying to its true purpose, and ban insider trading by legislators and government insiders. Until you do that, you will have the levels of corruption and the undermining of democracy that we've seen in recent decades. Sixth, reform the courts and depoliticize them, some through constitutional amendments, because obviously the way the Supreme Court is chosen, largely constitutional, not the number, but the process and the mechanism. I would love to see, and it'd need a constitutional amendment, I would love to see, you have the circuits, what are there, 16 circuits, whatever the federal circuits are, you could have presidents through the Senate approve those people, appoint those people, approve those, and then have, when there's a vacancy in the Supreme Court, maybe it's not lifetime would help, and then after that you have a lottery so that you just pick out of that federal judiciary, and those are the people that'll serve for a term. I don't know, I'm not a legal expert at all, but just some simple country social scientist, I think that might be a good solution to try to we've got to depoliticize the judiciary because it continues to exacerbate the division in our culture. Then number 6, to reform the courts and depoliticize them. I just said that, so we're at 7. 7, I got so excited about. Hold inviolate the separation of church and state. Yes. Make it a concrete wall that is unscalable. Because I can tell you as a clergy person, I really don't want the state to tell me what I'm to preach, how I'm to lead my people, how I'm to work among the congregations that I work among. They don't need to tell me, and I actually don't need to tell them or have religious tests or do anything like that. Do you realize that person can be perfectly competent and have no religious persuasion at all, and people of religious conviction can also be good leaders. I want to look for leadership qualities and expertise and skill and separate inviolably that wall between church and state. We need to get back to that, and we need to insist on it. And when people get a little too preachy to try to win over the crowd, we need to say, you may not have our support because you're feeding the wrong beast when you're catering to that rhetoric. Number 8, I think I am at 8, protect the civil service from undue political influence and vigorously enforce the Hatch Act. So no more political rallies at the White House or anything like that. You need to enforce that. 9, recommit to robust, publicly funded secular education. That's what made a difference in my life. That's what will continue to make a difference if we're to get through this horrendous period to the other side. And then lastly, which is good because that means I'm done. Actually, not bad. Just what Ron told me to do. He said an hour for this and a half hour. Dismantle the imperial presidency and codify the executive is not above the law, reversing current DOJ policies. And that's Democrat or Republican. It doesn't matter to me. No person should be above the law. We do not have a king, and we cannot have a king and not still have the United States of America. So, in conclusion, it took years of patience, organizing, and following a clear long-term trajectory for the Heritage Foundation and Christian nationalist elements to bring us to this place. It will take time to reverse it. Though, this is my optimism, it should not take quite as long because there's some good social memory still there. Now, here's the thing that's your challenge. I look out over the crowd, and most of you, with the exception of a few, are my age or older. You have social memory. There's a generation that doesn't have that social memory, and there are some that can only remember what we are currently seeing. We have a job to do. We have a job to do to help them to remember that. But as long as we can hearken to that social memory, it might not take too long to get back quickly to democratic norms. That's my optimism about that, that I think are still deeply ingrained in society. So that brings us, here's my bibliography and Q&A. I don't know if Ron, if there's a way.
There might be one person, at least one person in this room that will disagree with me, I'm sure. I'm not going to point that person out, but I'm sitting back there, and there's a couple things that Mike said, and heads are going like this, and I actually heard amen. And for that, just for that split second, I thought, I'm in a black church. Anyway, let's give Mike another hand.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay. Questions. And I do have a mic because I'm not sure if everyone will be able to hear.
There's sort of a mic there wrapped up in an enigma. What is that line from Chesterton? That's or was it Lewis? It might have been Lewis. I don't know. One of those Englishmen. Churchill. Yeah, there you go. So it was in English. I got the right right nation.
So I love your comments about follow the money.
Mm-hmm.
And you keep mentioning the Heritage Foundation.
Yes.
What is the equivalent that would work toward the goals, the top 10 that you have listed? Is there one organization, and what kind of money is behind it or could be behind it?
Yeah, there is not currently one organization. One of the organizations I referenced earlier, and the Center for Progressive Reform, you'll find a few progressive think tanks, but none of them have the resource base or the kind of long-standing, pervasive organization building that the Heritage Foundation has had. It really has been, it's created itself as a juggernaut. So right now there's nothing in its place. We saw some nascent kind of movements. I think Black Lives Matter really was a kind of helpful, it didn't do all of the policy, but it did some significant pieces. So there's potential there because that was really very decentralized, but very powerful. The No Kings kind of movement, but it's not really policy, it's really just protest. So I'm saying there's an infrastructure that's there that could be harnessed, but there really isn't an equivalent to the Heritage Foundation, though there are progressive think tanks, out there.
I disagree with you.
Yeah.
There's a group called the Committee on States.
Yes.
Which has what they call tables, and they bring together donors, large donors, and then groups like us, Citizens of Action, Indivisible, and so on.
Yes.
And it's a way of transferring money from the people that want specific things to happen to the groups that are actually going to try and implement those.
Yes, and what I think, I don't disagree with you, although I don't know that organization. What I think I'm thinking about is an organization that has the clout to bring politicians to heel, and we do not have an equivalent to that, but the Heritage Foundation is that. They select the judges that have been nominated in the last 2 Trump administrations, and we don't really have an equivalent to that. But you're quite right. There are nascent groups, and if we could kind of, one of the things progressives have to remember, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we can't have absolute agreement around everything before we coalesce around some of the most important things. And we've got to keep that in mind, because sometimes we can be as guilty of purity tests on our side as they can be on their side, and it really undermines an attempt to try to correct some of this, I think.
Brilliant presentation. I have a couple of observations. One is throughout the state of West Virginia, there's a group called For West Virginia's Future. It's looking to try to bring together some of these initiatives. Secondly, there's a wonderful journalist in Charleston by the name of Carrie Condenning. She is published extensively on Substack. She's got tremendous information available there. And then lastly, I think so often we Democrats tend to eat our young. We find differences and then find reasons to not support each other because of those differences.
You're exactly right.
Whereas, in fact, the Republicans in this movement, they have a bottom line. What's it going to cost us? What's it going to provide us? And we tend not to think as a focused fashion. So anyhow, it's a brilliant presentation. Thank you.
You're very kind.
I was wondering if the Democrats do get control, do you think they should expand the Supreme Court?
I think one of the things I've been concerned about is on the I'm a registered independent because I'm a progressive. It's not that I typically vote Democrat, but what I do find sometimes is sometimes they have a tendency to not want to take the positions I think they need to take. And so sometimes I think they're kind of in the Biden model of let's just let bygones be bygones and move forward. I would hope that you will see a sea change, and I would hope that there would be stopgap legislation after the next election cycle if it goes the way that it seems to be predicted. I just haven't seen a lot of track record. It's sort of like, well, I watched pieces today of it's kind of the Michelle Obama philosophy of if they go low, we go high. And so we go into these fights with our limbs tied behind our back. And so I'm not sure we're willing to go tit for tat to essentially say the court has become too politicized, it needs to be expanded, which it could be, because constitutionally it doesn't set the number of Supreme Court justices. But I just find when you talk to certain Democratic leaders and luminaries, they're very reticent. There are few that will say that, but they're very reticent to say that. So I worry a little bit that we play too nice, and you can't play nice with people who will destroy you as soon as look at you, because winning is the only thing they think about. It's not building a society, it's winning at all costs. That may be unfair, but that's how I've seen it. That's what I've observed about it. So I hope so. My longing is that would be the case. I worry it will not be.
I think we should keep protesting when
I agree.
they take over, so that they will do what they.
I absolutely agree. Because if you think, let's say both houses go, because there's a chance that the Senate could go to the Democrats as well. Less a chance, but there's still a chance. If all of the No Kings protests and all of that apparatus just drift away, then all's lost. We're just setting ourselves up for the next tin horn that comes along. And that's really. Unfortunate. So I wish I could be more optimistic. I have a son here who could talk at length about that, because he talks to me a lot about his concerns about that as a young voter, about the Democratic Party not having enough stamina to be able to resist tit for tat. You wonder where I got it. I actually learned it from him to talk at length about things.
So this educating we need to do.
Yes.
We've all become informed. What are creative ways to reach people?
That's right.
When the media is expensive and
That's
even
right.
spaces are expensive, and places like the League of Women Voters won't talk if the other side can't talk, or that's the rule. How do we find public spaces or ways to get these educational materials out and what we've learned?
I think one of the things, not the only option, but one of the options we have that doesn't cost a lot of money, it might cost some social capital, but that is to use our circle of influence. And what I mean by that is, I have relatives that'll say, you'll talk about something that this administration official said, or this action that's been implemented, or something the president said. And this, I think of one family member in particular who only watches one news source and said, well, I never heard anything about that. I wonder what it would be like to begin to curate a montage of actual clips of words from these people that you actually could show the people that still love you and have some level of trust, even if you don't see eye to eye, and help them to see outside the silo, because that seems to be the problem right now. It's just this black hole of any kind of contrary information in many of these media sources. And if you're using TikTok, which I don't know, anybody gets their news from TikTok, I'm suspicious of to start with, but algorithms drive that. And so it's going to silo in a natural kind of way. And it really, getting back to my radicalization work that I'm trying to develop and work on, that is one of the mechanisms for kind of changing thought and behavior, is to really silo information. And again, and if it's misinformation, then you're really, really in bad shape. I cannot tell you the number of people that I've talked to that believe that a pizza joint that has no basement was really abusing children in their basement in Washington, D.C., and apparently Hillary Clinton was in charge of it all. You see, I don't know what you do with that. I don't know what you do with that. But except to maybe, what do they say, sunlight is the greatest sanitizer and disinfectant, and so maybe to curate some feeds that help people to see something else. But start with your circle of influence and see what you can do, because as long as you have for-profit corporate media, you're really not, and that's, even if you're looking to kind of somewhat progressive sources, they're still beholden to shareholders in the end, and they don't always give us the whole picture either. Some of that gets softened and muted. And if you don't believe me, it's really, now look at, I don't know how many times, what was it, that President Biden at one European trip went kind of off camera to talk to some veterans that he had seen, and all we saw in all the media was just how he was losing it and wondering, did anybody observe the recent European trip? I just don't know what, but hardly ever mention in any of the media. So there's this kind of, all the corporate interests are fearful of this kind of lawsuit, this litigation and kind of punitive approach to regulatory punitive approach. Yeah.
So I have a question about, turning point and a different version
Yeah.
to educate college students.
That's right.
And recruit college students that would, is there any group that is doing that? And is that?
I'm sure there are groups. There are no national groups that I know of. Here's one of the things that I would say. This is what I always tell my students. I always told them I was the professor their grandparents warned them about. But here's how I always thought of that. They were always, many people, especially in rural West Virginia, where I also was from, you go to college and those professors, they brainwash you there. Okay, let me help you understand the brainwashing process. And many of you are college educated, but we need to respond to people who say that. When you go to college, you're offered this huge, diverse view of the world and a variety of opinions and ideas. So the people that say you're being brainwashed are those who say our brainwashing could no longer hold, and because you now see the world differently, you must be brainwashed because our small view of the world must be right, and your broad view of the world now makes you an oddity. You're brainwashed. And I ask my students the question, who's brainwashed? Those exposed to broad ideas or those who are taught to look through a very narrow framework and understand the entire world through that? Well, it's kind of axiomatic, isn't it? The reality is what college does is unbrainwash. And I don't say that people in their communities mean to brainwash. It's just their way of life and that's what they teach. But when you go to college, it's broad. So I hope if college doesn't acquiesce and preemptively get in fear, the only time I was ever told to rein it in was in the School of Social Work. I mean, there's no lefter group in the world in the School of Social. I used to teach English at Fairmont State, and I'm even surprised at the things I got by saying, while I was there. And so people are fearful, they're afraid. And so you get one student who said, I think he's been too disrespectful to the president. So I get called into the director's office and say, you need to rein it in a little bit. And I'm thinking, this is the School of Social Work. We're supposed to be out there protesting and out there getting arrested and out there tearing down systems. And that's what we're supposed to be doing, not acquiescing to somebody's threat that they might withhold some funding. So there's where we're at. So I hope the institutions of higher learning can still do that. And I suppose Turning Point saw themselves as an alternative to the structure of higher education. So I don't know that there's an alternative to that I can think of. You may know someone.
I just want to add one comment for the whole room. The Office of Management and Budget has come out with a new policy, new changes they want to make to something called uniform guidance. Uniform guidance is how all procurement is done through the federal government. And there are phrases that indicate that decisions will no longer be made by experts. They will be made by people in appointed positions that will serve the will of the executive, okay? That comments to that can be made through July 13th. The APLU is the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities, has several position papers on their website that you can read to become educated, and anybody can put in a response. More responses have been generated for this edition of the uniform guidance than ever have been. So anyway, if you want to do something to take action right now, that is really important.
Yeah. When I was planning to do my doctoral research, of course, I'm working with transgender and non-binary individuals. And so my advisor said, there's probably not going to be a lot of funding for that. I said, thankfully, I don't need any funding. It's a qualitative small study. I can fund myself. But, projects like that could not expect federal funding at this juncture and level. And they're needed now as much as ever, it seems to me. And so there are some of us that can do that work and will continue to do that work in advocacy and scholarship.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. Actually, that brought something up, what you just discussed. I get a lot of feeds, and one of the ones I got just today was about a new thing, open for comment. The comment times seem to be getting smaller and smaller. There's only 8 days left, and I will get information to Ron, and then people can contact Ron about this, if you'd like to make a comment. But one of the things that came in my feed today was about they're trying to put together a regulation, and I couldn't read the actual regulation. I just read a synopsis of it on the info that came into my feed, but it would require anyone who would apply for any sort of job in the federal government. That's pretty broad. It would basically hold them to a non-disclosure agreement, very Trumpian. Not only covering what they could not say, could not reveal anything that was considered to be proprietary or reserved information or secret information. Which,
Or incriminating, I imagine, but I'm sorry.
Not even just while they're
That's right.
employed, but thereafter. And it would be for anyone. And there's also was, I think it's maybe close to a time for no longer able to make public commentary about this, but there was one specifically, I get Scientific American, and they were pleading with people to make comments to the government about all final decisions about funding any kind of scientific research would be made by basically bureaucrats without any scientific background.
Yeah.
And so these things they're all over the place.
That's on my
all over the place.
That's the uniform guidance.
Yeah, all over the place.
Because expertise is to be mistrusted in this framework. That's the policy, yeah.
And I wanted to, actually had another comment. I wanted to, actually kind of a question. In your points of things that would be things to be addressed, you did make a couple of comments that would kind of imply like we need to maybe have a constitutional amendment about this. Like maybe Citizens United would be one of those things. I know some of the states are trying to find ways around that to like not, say, provide certification for corporations to practice, to have it basically be certified to practice business within their state if they did not meet certain requirements. And a lot of legal scholars think that's not going to work. Montana's one of the states doing that now. And so people are saying the only way we could maybe get rid of Citizens United would be a constitutional amendment. And my concern is like opening the Constitution now to amendments is likely to go to be a big win for the other side.
Exactly. The only thing that's, I think, helpful, I don't want to interrupt, I want to comment on that. The only thing I think is helpful is the other side's insistence on something called constitutional originalism, which isn't a thing. It's as if they tried to turn the Constitution to sacred scripture or something. But my hunch is, and it's just looking at history, how we've responded in history, that when this administration is done and all of the skeletons are laid out for everyone to see, there'll be such a backlash. You've seen this historically in movements where there is enough popular support to correct those things. And if it has to be, I mean, think about the progressive era in the late 1900s or 1800s, early 20th century of progressive things around. Of course, there was also the temperance movement, but the point is there were other very progressive changes that were made constitutionally. And I think we could enter a cycle or a season of that once all of that information gets out there, because that happened when people just spread word of mouth and newspapers were printed. Imagine in an internet wired world when the skeletons are out for everybody to see, there may be such a shocking groundswell that there's popular movement to address some of this. I hope. I may be wrong because again, it may be that we just change governments and the oligarchs stay in place and then nothing really changes. And that's my other worry. I didn't mean to, please go on.
We should also keep in mind Robert C. Byrd's admonition, if you have opposition, run scared. And Donald Trump has pulled enough rabbits out of the hat, and he's changed the election laws so much. I don't think we should just count on the groundswell of opposition as carrying the day. And I really encourage all of us to get as involved as we can in political races, because you can't count on the media of any sort, mass media or social media, to provide us with any information.
That's right.
And ultimately, I'd like to think that the truth will set us free. Let's continue to get more information out like this. I'm currently preparing a journal article on the commercial determinants of public education. Yeah. And I'd like to read your article about, by the way, the Hope Scholarship.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to make a very brief comment. 54 years ago yesterday, Gordon Liddy broke into the Watergate complex.
Yeah.
And we kind of saw what happened as a consequence of that.
Yeah.
I want to thank you. That's a very positive thought. It was. Is anybody, I mean, I remember that election. I worked for McGovern. He got swamped in the biggest defeat in American history. And, 2 years later, Nixon was gone.
Yeah.
I just want to comment, there's been a couple comments about the Supreme Court. I want to say that, if you look at the Constitution, the Supreme Court has absolutely zero authority to rule on the constitutionality of laws. If we want to overturn Citizens United, Congress can do that with a law.
Yeah.
It doesn't require any constitutional amendment at all. Anything, Congress has authority over the court system in the Constitution. They can say, no, that we don't agree with that. We're passing a law saying prohibiting that. And they can also say the Supreme Court has no authority to review this law. So there is, and again, this gets back to your point. We have to not play fair and trust in the good honor and good intentions of the other side. If we're going to deal with the Supreme Court, that can be done. They can be completely neutered that way.
Thank you.
But let's give Mike a big hand.